Today we're talking about a very hot topic, which is placemaking. And this is the latest in a series of sessions in the run-up to a new event which we're launching in London in November later this year, the Urban Living Festival. It's taking place at Tobacco Dock on November the 25th and 26th. We hope to see loads of you there. It's a new type of event. It's themed around 3 stages: stay, live and work. And we'll be looking at how various hospitality and real estate asset classes are converging and what the future looks like. It's going to be a great event. So hope to see lots of you there. The discussion here will be around about 45 minutes. If you have any questions, you can add them in the chat function on your Zoom screen, and we'll get around to hopefully 10 or 15 minutes of Q&A at the end. I've got a couple of colleagues helping out, Joe and Justin, to manage everything. And as I said earlier, if you could keep your sound muted so we don't get any feedback or interruptions, that will be fantastic. Thank you. My name's George Sell. I'm the Editor-in-Chief here at International Hospitality Media. We are a B2B publisher for the hospitality sector, as well as an event organizer. I've got a fantastic panel of 4 experts joining me today. I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves shortly, but before we do that, I just wanted to show a couple of slides to give today's discussion some context and some background. So this quote, I think, sums up what we're going to be talking about today. Placemaking satisfies a common human need for a sense of belonging. This need is primal and fundamental to our happiness and well-being. We're hardwired to search out meaning in the landscape and a sense of place. Place-less developments and environments are inherently detrimental to our well-being. Great places stem from a clear local identity with which people and communities can identify, intrinsically linked to the location's memorability. We attribute value to places whose clear, legible design language makes them memorable. This strong sense of identity created by well-designed places instills a human connection, adding commercial, civic and social value to all the functions of a place, be those shopping, dwelling, working, learning or relaxing. So this is pretty important stuff we're talking about today. Some other interesting quotes here. Ralph Zucker of Somerset has kind of distilled that lengthy quote earlier, and he just says it's about making places with heart and soul, which is a nice concept. Good design will require planners to think beyond the business as usual approach to housing, streets, retail, green spaces, social infrastructure. And you can see that placemaking is affecting all kinds of organisations, from developers, government, planners, health service. You know, this really can affect every aspect of the way we live. Edinburgh Council, for example, is looking at a placemaking strategy using the Internet of Things and trying to adapt to a post-COVID world. Placemaking interventions can reduce the impact of unequal access to healthcare in some areas of the country, according to a new report from Mace. So this is big stuff. So we're going to have a 40 to 45 minute chat about this. I'd like to ask my panelists to introduce themselves first. And Eliza, as you have placemaking in your job title, I think maybe you should go first.
Hi everyone. So I am head of product and business development at Roundhill Capital. So Roundhill Capital is a investment management firm, fully vertically integrated. So we do sort of everything soup to nuts, from acquisitions, development, asset management, all the way down to property management. We currently have around 6 billion AUM, about 14 offices across Europe, UK, the States. And we predominantly focus on residential real estate. And we have a few master plans under our belt. So we're doing currently one in the south of Spain in Marbella, and one in Porto in Portugal. So working on sort of the idea of placemaking and master planning on both of those. Previous to Roundhill, I've done large-scale placemaking work in New Zealand, in Auckland, where I'm from, which was a 9-city block regeneration project in city centre. And then from there on, I owned my own consulting firm for a while, worked for WeWork for a while. So diverse 10 years in real estate.
Great, thank you. I should have mentioned earlier that all the LinkedIn profiles of our panelists are in the chat function there. So if you'd like to connect with them, then go right ahead. Thanks, Eliza. Michael, would you like to introduce yourself, please?
Good morning, everybody. Thanks for having us here, George. I'm Michael Goldin. I run business development for NoiseAware. NoiseAware is a privacy-safe noise monitoring company. We were founded as the result of an Airbnb house party, and I'm sure you've seen news lately. It's year over year, we've seen a 47% increase in noise incidences year over year. When noise levels at your property exceed certain thresholds that you set, we will let you know in real time, and that way you can mitigate against any escalation that you need to take at your property. We're widely adopted here in North America and eagerly awaiting our global expansion.
Thanks, Michael. Peter, over to you.
Yes, I'm Peter Heule. Have my office here in Amsterdam, and out of Amsterdam I run two companies, Shortstay Group and Yace, focusing predominantly on Yace in building it up across Europe, with now 4 hotels open in Amsterdam, one in Barcelona, one in Paris, and we are opening The Hague and Antwerp in the coming 5 months. So really excited, and I think placemaking is a great topic, and definitely something that could be further developed in the coming years as well in our concept and brand, as we say, unlocking the neighborhood. And by unlocking the neighborhood, it automatically means that our guests become resident, even if it's, they only stay for 2 or 3 nights. And therefore, we need full cooperation of local shop owners, restaurant, bars, cafes, and all other stakeholders in the direct vicinity of the hotels.
Thanks, Peter. Francesca, over to you. Hi, Francesca, can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Hi. Thanks, guys. Thanks for having me, George.
Pleasure.
I am Francesca, and I'm one of the co-founders at Bimble. Bimble is the app for great little places, where you can discover and remember the places that you love in neighborhoods all over the world. So we all hear about, read about, or come across places that we'd like to go to, or we have places that we've been to that we've loved and we want to remember. But where do we keep that information? So the Bimble app is your space to collect and organize the places that mean something to you. And we have a community aspect. So Bimble makes it easy and fun for you to explore the places that everybody else is saving too. So where this becomes relevant for hospitality is making Bimble, the app, makes it really easy to share place recommendations with your guests, or to reach out to your potential guests. It also, to use the hotel, Peter, as an example, it gives you the opportunity to make yourself discoverable amongst a community of people who are looking to go out in that place, in that city. And we launched our iOS app in February.
Okay, great. Thanks, Francesca. I can't remember if I mentioned earlier, but this session is being recorded, and everybody who has registered will get a recording of it in the next couple of days. So you don't need to scribble notes furiously. You'll get the whole thing in your inbox shortly. Okay, thanks for the introductions, guys. So let's start by trying to define what we're talking about. So Eliza, what does placemaking mean to you? How can you sort of condense the meaning of it into a manageable soundbite?
Well, placemaking is very multidisciplinary, right? So to create a great place, it takes many people. It takes architects, it takes urban planners, it takes creatives, it takes the people that want to live and work there. And successful places with high values are synonymous with good placemaking. Where those have naturally developed over time, so historic city centers that have been developed by humans being there for thousands of years, or development that has been truly mixed use, that has facilitated that placemaking and accelerated that process. To me, great placemaking, is truly mixed use space. So, you have your fishmonger next to an office space, next to a restaurant. And I think that there's a huge amount we can learn about placemaking from the classic historic city centers that have, worked and have been created for thousands of years. And so to me, that is a great place to start and to learn from. And so looking at our historic city centers in every city and understanding why they are so successful. So, they're aesthetically beautiful. There are diverse mixed use spaces. There are small winding streets that create authenticity and comfort and experience behind every corner, right? There's pubs and restaurants spilling out onto footpaths. You never know what you're going to find behind that next corner. And I think an accumulation of all of those things creates a great place and a sense of place. And I think that's what placemaking is for me anyway. And that's what I try to create when I work on projects.
I think it's fair to say that a lot of modern development of recent times has moved away from that kind of traditional layout. Do you think that master planners and placemakers now are trying to look to the past for inspiration because they've kind of thrown away a lot of what was good before?
I really hope so. And as humans, we always try to reinvent and become better, and often it's trial and error, right? And there obviously are many successful developments that don't follow this sort of line of placemaking, but I think that we're now more and more seeing truly mixed use development, which is a fantastic kind of direction. Some more sort of homogenous development that only resi or only commercial business parks and so on was a little bit driven by the commercials behind it and planning. And so as those two things are starting to change, the drivers and the incentives to build those homogenous developments are also changing. So demand is changing. Millennials are now driving demand and where they want to live and where they want to work and what kind of environment they want to be in. And they're much more aware of curating a lifestyle and an experience around them. And so those environments have become a lot more important from a demand perspective as well, not only the commercial drivers and the planning drivers behind it.
Okay, great, thanks. Michael, what does placemaking mean to you?
Yeah, I mean, I think Eliza did a really good job of describing it from design and architectural standpoint. I think it's also designed with intention, and it's a place that you feel like you belong and you're comfortable in. And each neighborhood or subset of areas takes on its own little identity, and people can relate with these different identities, whether it's living there or wanting to go visit there or wanting to go eat and shop there. I'm from Atlanta, and Atlanta's got a very diverse population, and there's literally just neighborhoods that if you go one weekend to one part of town, it's like you're in a whole different world, and you can travel 1 or 2 miles in another direction, and it takes on an entirely different feeling. And there's energy levels that might ebb and flow with different areas. Some might be sleepy designs for families or retired folks, and others might be vibrant for students and things like that. I think it builds an inherent trust system within the neighborhood and community you live in. It's asking your neighbor for sugar, or helping the old guy next door set up his computer. Being a regular at your local coffee shop or your pub, you're actually getting to know these small business owners and developing a relationship and helping the whole community thrive.
Peter, when we were talking earlier, you got onto the subject of scale, and you mentioned that planners and local authorities are keen to attribute the term placemaking to some pretty small, very localized schemes. Do you think when it comes to new building, new developments, you need a certain amount of scale to truly create a place? I think you're muted, Peter.
With placemaking, there's this discrepancy or challenge, so to say, between social ambitions and commercial ambitions. And if you are a good planner from a commercial perspective, and a good planner from a social perspective, so hired by a town or a municipality or a city to do your work, and you sit around a table, that means that you have really to open up the discussion, and that is also placemaking. Placemaking, in my opinion, also means that the people sitting around the table are open and honest, and set aside their own beliefs and their own truths to have everything on the table and come up with the best development for a bigger area, not only your specific plot. And that, I think, what I mentioned before, in some cities, really difficult. If you as a developer only have a really small plot, and you are in a bigger development with 20 other small developers, to get them all around the table aligned to talk about communal spaces, shared spaces, parks, while nobody's willing to pick up the bill, that is challenging, right? But it can be done if planners from a municipality perspective appoint bigger developments to one developer or a conglomerate of developers together, and that they oblige them to work together to come up with a bigger idea of a plot or a development. Then it can be done. And also in line with what was said before, I think good placemaking comes also from the belief that what really works in geography is small towns, villages, where everything is on walking distance, right? So there is not, like you see in the bigger cities, a place for shopping and a place to eat food and a place for offices. No, everything should be on walking distance. And that is more and more, I think, also the bigger belief of planners in general, that we have a big, and we see that now with COVID, a big mobility issue all around the globe. Of course, between countries, but also in cities and municipalities. And to overcome that means that you need to reach all the things that you want to reach within walking or cycling distance. And therefore, I think placemaking is absolutely not a buzzword, but something that needs to be at the forefront of any planner.
Thanks, Peter. Francesca, your app is based around people falling in love with places and people having great experiences and great times in specific places. Do you think there is a correlation between urban design, where placemaking has been thoughtfully done, thoughtfully applied, and the kind of reaction that people that use your app get to it? Do you think could you see a correlation between great design and great reviews on your app, for example?
Yes, absolutely. So we aren't a review app, so you can't give reviews. It's really about a place for you to celebrate in a positive way the places that you love and that you want to remember. But yeah, I mean, placemaking to me is about bringing together the elements that enable people to feel an emotional connection with that place. So certainly we see, like, the behavior that we see on the app are where a city like Amsterdam, for example, where there are lots of independent businesses, there is a sense of community already. People enjoy going to those places and talking about them and sharing them on the app. Absolutely. But what we're also learning is that it doesn't matter where you are, in what neighborhood, anywhere in the world, these places exist. Everywhere has different types of thriving communities, you know, whether that is SME retail, whether it is hospitality, and that, you know, that is what placemaking needs to focus on and bring about.
Okay, thank you. Placemaking in terms of new neighbourhoods, new developments, is broadly accepted to include things like communal spaces, green spaces, public realm, quality of air, a lot of things that cost a lot of money, basically. So I think we need to talk about the ROI and how developers can balance applying these very beneficial and desirable traits with balancing the books. Eliza, I think you've got some numbers about that.
Yeah. So this is something that I focus a lot on and need to prove in most days of my job, is that there is a return on investment in the sort of placemaking activities and placemaking steps that we take. And so there's a great study done by Savills, specifically led by Yolanda Barnes, who actually, if you guys are interested in placemaking, does exceptional work in that field. And what they did is look at 3 different types of development. So new development that really thought about placemaking, truly sustainable development, truly mixed use. So places like Crown Street in Glasgow, Poundbury in Dorset, and a few others. Then they took development nearby, that's what you would call, unfortunately, standard development. So pretty homogenous, not a lot of placemaking happening there. And then they looked at the sort of closest historic city centers. As you would expect, the historic city centers were sort of the highest value. But what they found was that the value and the way that they kind of got apples for apples is they took the price of every building and then divided by the hectares. And so they were able to get to an apples for apples. And what they found was that the new development with placemaking was in line with historic centers in terms of value, and was about between, it varied, but between 18 to 45% higher value than standard development with no placemaking. And I think that is just fundamental evidence of why, you know, any master planning developer that, you know, is doing any large scale work needs to deeply think about placemaking and have a multidisciplinary team leading that. And, you know, one added very interesting fact why councils should really care about this too, is that if you create a place where people continue to hang out in, as in, you know, they go to the shop, they go to the restaurant in their neighborhood, you create one job per household in that neighborhood. And that is a true ecosystem and has huge amounts of value. And so kind of, I think these statistics should be screamed across the development community. The only thing I have to mention is that the sum of the value takes time to be created, and time is always against the developer. And so we need to think about how to create more long-term investment in real estate, rather than having, you know, the 5-8 year kind of landscape that we often work on.
Do you think that large developers now are accepting that this is a practice that they do have to adopt, or is it still very much the pioneers that are really committed?
I think absolutely. I think that most developers now truly understand the value of it and are trying to do better. But there are a lot of kind of obstacles in their way. One, as I mentioned, is timescale. So most investment being 5 to 7 years, it makes it difficult to show the value of some of these things. Second is planning. So planning is now changing a lot, but that's always an obstacle for truly mixed use development. There's a myriad of other issues, but I think that the value is starting to be understood. I think we as a development community now need to work together to overcome some of those obstacles. Great,
thanks. Peter, you're in an interesting situation in that one of your latest properties to open at Entrepothaven in Amsterdam is actually part of a whole new neighborhood that's taking shape. Can you tell us a bit about that and how that whole area has come together and who are the players behind it?
Yeah, so the interesting thing here is that I think already 10, 11 years ago, in the middle of the last crisis, or the peak, the lowest point of the last crisis, there was one developer who, by different entities, bought up different plots, because actually it's against rules and regulations for one developer to buy a lot of plots and to develop those in Amsterdam, and actually in the majority of the Netherlands. So they played a little bit around the rules by doing that via several entities, and then when they had the whole plot, they combined all the entities and they took up the whole development, which was of course a little bit in a gray area, but I think also a smart way to do it, and it caused them now, and not the whole area is not completely finished yet. It is expected to be finished in 2024. But already now it's one of the most highly valued neighborhoods across the whole of Amsterdam. While it's not even finished, for residents to live in, but also for offices, for smaller shops. And I think it's for Amsterdam really a best practice of how a new neighborhood, so completely new development within 10 years. It's almost feels like it has been there forever, and the whole feeling of walking around there, everything what I said before, everything is in walking distance. Everything you can go by bike everywhere. You don't see cars. The cars are underground. Don't see cars in the streets. Really well done. So. Sounds strange, but if you are a big developer and you can control everything, you don't have to go to all small details to the municipality, then it works. And what they did really well is around 3 years ago, when we started to have our highest peak into the development, they invited everyone to sit around the table and said, okay, we have these communal spaces. This is a park. This is a play garden. This is where we want to create some restaurants and bars. This is where we want to do some small boutique shops. What is your idea about it? And they asked me, but they also asked several people that already live there. They asked several F&B consultants and other people that already had impact or were active in this neighborhood. And by doing that, of course, you get a lot of opinions, and that's always difficult to get a lot of opinions and ideas at first. And that's maybe the biggest challenge in placemaking. You get so many ideas, so many opinions that you cannot make everybody happy. But by getting all this information, you can make a really interesting neighborhood and make it much better. And then, of course, there's big ROIs. And we all in this neighborhood, I already see it happening. Square meter prices for residential are going sky high. Second thing, if that is a good thing, but for investors, that is a good thing. So yeah. new developments. I'm really keen to see across Europe how new developments are going to work out, and if placemaking is going to be at the foreground.
So it sounds like these guys had a pretty clear plan of how they were going to do the whole neighborhood well in advance, rather than piecemeal development.
Yeah, they were since 2008-9, when the crisis started. They were already working on it. The lowest low was in Amsterdam was 2014, and then they had 4 or 5 years already to think about this idea. The municipality of Amsterdam was working on creating a place for more residential. There were still some spots that were owned by the municipality, so they knew that this was coming, and then they had 5 years to get this game in motion. And I think that is also what a good developer and also institutional investors should do, right? To plan these things and to be a little bit ahead of the game, and then get everybody around the table to come up with a great solution to a new neighborhood.
And do you think the fact that your company has this neighborhood focused approach, and your tagline is unlock the neighborhood, did that help you to become part of this? Is that what attracted your company to the developer?
Yeah, 100%. So we try to do the same with the small development team that I have now 6 people. We try to look at areas that are definitely not city center, because gays can never be in a city center, especially not the touristic city centers. And I want to be on the outskirts of the city, looking for real neighborhoods. And if the neighborhoods, and even more, neighborhoods that are not yet developed. So I'm looking at and what is going to be in 5 years from now, the places that are going to be having gentrification, where are the big developers working at new developments. And although we are a small company, we send emails, and I do a lot of phone calls with these bigger developments, and they are more than ever. 4 years ago it was more difficult for me, but now they like these smaller companies, right? So in the bigger development, they say, okay, we prefer to have some of these smaller players instead of, with all due respect, the Starbucks and a Holiday Inn and H&M and what have you. They say, okay, that's all nice, and maybe we need 2 or 3 players in a bigger development that sort of pay the bills. But to make a neighborhood thriving, we need to have these smaller restaurants, cafes, bars, smaller boutique hotel type of things to make the whole neighborhood interesting, also for 10, 20, 30 years from now. Yeah. And then, of course, there's a challenge if it's a developer in there for the short term, right? So develop it, sell it off. Then it's maybe less of importance, but the majority, especially if there's pension funds involved, and they keep like 40%, for instance, for lease, then they have a bigger say in this. Yeah, and it's also in their best interest.
Thanks, Peter. Francesca, does what Peter is saying tally with your app users' experience? Does having a healthy crop of varied and independent businesses make the kind of place that people fall in love with, rather than the typical high street brands that you see everywhere?
Yeah, absolutely. And we have just seen a huge move towards that, driven by millennials, as you were referring to earlier. Yeah, exactly. I mean, to the point that even credit card companies are now chasing after independent businesses, because that is where millennials want to be spending their money. And ultimately, it's about people enjoying working in a place, whether it's visiting a place or actually living in that place, and having a community, that feels interesting, is the way that you do that. I was reminded actually while you were talking, Peter, about a lady that we spoke to recently who runs tour groups to countries. And she was saying that she brings tour groups from the USA into a certain part of Spain. And she was saying, you know, 5 to 7 years ago, her tour groups would arrive and they would want to, in their downtime, go and visit recognizable chains. You know, it might be that they wanted to go and get a coffee at Starbucks after 5 days. And she said now that has completely shifted into they want a local experience, they want an authentic experience, they want to seek out places that feel really unusual and typical of that place.
Okay, thanks, Francesca. Michael, I'm quite interested in the effect of good and bad design on behaviour and how people act in a certain environment. From your experience, do you think that people respond in the way they behave to the environments around them, and do you see worse behaviour in poorly designed environments?
Yes and no. I mean, people are people. There's good people and there's bad people. We all know that. But I think when it comes to the design, you certainly need to know who you're building for. If you're building for, you know, the elderly, it all has to be handicap accessible and on one floor and have certain features and amenities. If you're building for students, you know, they don't need much space. They don't mind being crammed on top of each other, and they're going to spend most of the time outside of the unit. If you're designing flexible or that's kind of the buzzword lately is flexible rentals. I think you guys are doing a webinar on that in a couple of weeks. But if you're designing those, you have to be able to figure out what goes well with people who plan on living there for a year, 2 years, 5 years, as well as what people are planning on doing for 1 night, 2 nights, 3 nights. Everybody wants to live like a local, as one of the OTAs says. And in order to do that, you also have to act like a local. And what we see is a lot of times travelers don't act like locals. So you do need to put measures into place like NoiseAware to ensure that your guests aren't disturbing the rest of the community, the rest of the neighborhood, the rest of the property. When it's natural, when you go on holiday, you like to have fun. You stay up later than you normally do. You might have beverages on nights that you wouldn't normally buy, but it's if you design the spaces right, they're going to spend time in the unit when they should be in the unit, like regular normal people, and then you're going to encourage them to go visit the pub down the street or the live music venue or the comedy club, whatever it may be that your neighborhood is good with and has attracted. So sustainable building is also important. I think, and kudos to everybody on the call, it took 40 minutes before someone brought up COVID, but I'm going to be that guy. Before COVID, you designed a certain way, but so many people are working from home now. They're changing what their house looks like or what their flat looks like in order to accommodate for video calls that we're all doing. And so you have to be able to design a property with several different flexible uses and how it can ebb and flow with time. Urbanization or a fleeing from urban communities, right? Those units need to be flexible for long-term tenants or for short-term travelers. And to go back to the previous question on ROI, a great way to increase ROI is to decrease turnover and decrease vacancy. You decrease turnover by having happy neighbors, tenants, community, less stressed, not sitting in an hour-long commute every day each way. And when that happens, you have less turnover or less properties, neighborhood houses, flats for sale. And as supply declines, price increases. And so that definitely takes time. But when you build a community that everyone loves and wants to be a part of and is happy in, they are going to stay, and that's going to drive your prices up.
Thanks, Michael. Just a quick reminder to everybody that if you have any questions for our panelists, please do submit them in the chat function on Zoom, and we'll move on to those shortly. Okay, so we've established that developers are pretty much on board with the placemaking concept. Investors are, and end users seem to be too. What about planners? Are they up to speed? Are they fully aware with the latest trends, or are they still finding it all a bit daunting? Eliza, maybe you'd like to go first on this one.
Sure. I think it's a very difficult question. You know, I've had a number of fantastic experiences working with councils. I think from my experience, I can say if you're able to involve your local authority as early as possible, and you show them your true, very long-term commitment to the land and what you're building there, and you show that you will truly work with all the stakeholders, not just the ones that are pro that development, I think it becomes a lot easier. So taking everyone that's important or a stakeholder in their journey along with you from the very, very start. I think that the whilst the new PD permitted development regulation that's come in very, very new is you know, definitely being questioned, and there's some controversy around it. You know, it is a step in the direction of diversifying the high street, which I think is great. Obviously, I think we need a lot more information and a lot more of a framework to work with to ensure that what is created with this permitted development is great for the community and great for the neighborhood, but fundamentally allowing more flexibility to what you can do with buildings on high streets, I think is great as a concept, to allow, you know, a more diverse experience, to allow small businesses to potentially survive, to allow, you know, offices and even residential to be there in a much more real sense, I think is going to be great for the neighborhood and creating those diverse neighborhoods and communities that we're talking about that are, you know, the epicenter of great place to live.
I won't ask you to name and shame, but could you name and praise any specific cities or boroughs or anyone who you think has got a great approach to this?
Oh, I couldn't possibly, but
Even good ones?
I'm sure they're all fantastic.
Well, that's a politician's answer if I've ever heard one. Peter, how about in the Netherlands and Amsterdam? How engaged are the planners and the local authorities with the placemaking agenda?
The funny thing, there's a big contradiction. They are really committed. They really wanted this high on their agenda, but when it comes to play, then it's not working, right? So, and what does it result in? So of course, in Amsterdam, the majority of the land is still owned by the municipality, and if they have to give out plots, they make a calculation of the value, right? Common sense. But if you want to do good placemaking, you also have to maybe devaluate the value to make the placemaking happen, right? You cannot say, okay, there's a specific piece of land, and you make a calculation. If there was only top-notch residential, then it doesn't work. So the land values over the last 5 years have been crazy high, and therefore for developers there's less and less space to be creative, right? So, and that makes it really, really difficult. So you can scream that you want it, but if you do not make it available in terms of land values, then yeah, it's simply not going to happen, and you cannot cry afterwards, right? But the good thing is, and then unfortunately that only happens again with the small plots. I made a joke about the play field for kids, the 40 square meters that they make available for these types of things. But That said, the municipality of Amsterdam, they have done bigger things. So they create some plots, especially in Amsterdam North, for private individuals to be creative and create their own house, and also in a combination, for instance, with 50, 60 houses, and there they also get a communal space which they can shape by themselves, which is interesting, especially from a residential perspective. But those developments are really, really small, right? So it's and then it's easy, of course, for municipalities to show off with these small developments.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Michael, something that's just occurred to me. We're talking a lot here about urban locations, city centre or secondary urban locations, places where people live and places where people work, and so on. What about resort locations? Do you think these placemaking principles apply there as well, and do they differ in resorts, and if so, how?
Yeah, I think urban locations can probably take a book out of resort towns playbook. You know, go to a ski town in the Alps. You can walk the whole town. There's super authentic shops and local goods and foods and cheeses and things like that. It's definitely a sense of community, and people that live there, you know, they belong there. That's what's home and what feels right for them. And as a traveler, you can feel that as well. You know, I think to a lot of those towns' credit, we can all on the urban side take a pointer from them on how they're doing it and how they're doing it right and how they're keeping it local and keeping it authentic and keeping it real. And a lot of these places are super, super small. In slow season, they might only have a few thousand permanent residents. For us to implant that into an urban city center, to Peter's point, it needs to be a fairly small feel or a local feel, but have access to all the things that you would want in urban living. So yeah, I think it's a really good and interesting point.
Eliza, have you ever worked with developers on sort of resort projects, resort master plans, and if so, how do they differ from urban ones?
Unfortunately, I haven't had the pleasure. I have always worked within urban environments, but one thing I can add is that this idea of a small town having this feeling of authenticity is not dissimilar to your neighborhood, right? I think London's a perfect example. It's a set of neighborhoods, right? Notting Hill is very different to Shoreditch, which is very different to Hampstead Heath, and each has their own kind of identity and their own feeling. And I think as we now, in a post-COVID world, spend more time in our neighborhoods, we'll commute less and spend more time around our home, means that we will spend more money around there, which will bolster those authentic small businesses, and which will allow for sort of more culture and more real sense of place to start happening in the neighborhoods that potentially might have been deprived from some of the income that their residents have been seeing as they have been taking it into the city centers on most days.
Okay, thanks. I'd like to start winding up by asking each of you in turn to name your favorite example of placemaking in a new neighborhood that you've seen recently, and why you like it and why you think it's successful. So Peter, do you want to kick off first?
That is not easy.
I didn't give you this question in advance deliberately.
No, but that's good. To keep it close to home, I think, of course, but we talked about that, the neighborhood that I'm in Amsterdam with Jees Antipohaven, that's really well done. It's not completely finished, so I'm excited to see what is happening over the course of the next 4 years. But what is also definitely a go-to place in Amsterdam is Amsterdam North. And if you go directly opposite of the A river, so you take the ferry to it's only 3 minutes from Central Station up north. Directly it was completely industrial. I think just 7 years ago, and what they have created there, a little bit by accident. So not a lot of people involved in planning actually. So it was more accidental and experimental. There's offices, there's F&B outlets, there's residential, there's a big skate park now being built. It's actually the biggest skate park of the whole of Europe, in the middle of residential upper upscale value, so to say, which is crazy. So normally you would never do that, but actually the people living there were involved, sort of, and it's crazy. If you walk there, first instance you think everything is completely wrong, but if you're there like for half an hour, you suddenly understand what is happening there, and there's great vibe. It's not really Dutch. It feels more like a global place, so to say. So definitely also not Amsterdam. The majority of Amsterdam people do not like it. Which for me means that it was well done.
Okay, thanks. Francesca, you obviously hear about lots and lots of great places in your job, but what's an example that you love of successful placemaking?
I think a neighbourhood and an area in general, I would say, is East London, actually, rather unpredictably. We wouldn't have said that 20 years ago. But I have to say, we see thriving independent businesses. We see outdoor spaces that are filled with people from the local community, as well as people coming in. We see entrepreneurs being able to show up. Rents are still affordable, so they can actually be creative and experiment. And I think because of that too, it attracts interesting people to come and live and work there with a community spirit. So I think it's a place, it's a part of London that we see saved to the site a lot, and has outperformed, for want of a better word, more well-known neighbourhoods like Notting Hill, actually.
Great, thanks. Eliza, let's go to yours next, and also a supplementary question that Francesca has prompted there. How does successful placemaking enable a neighbourhood to remain accessible to everybody? Because we've all heard of stories of neighbourhoods becoming trendy, and the people who have made it attractive being forced out because they can't afford to stay there anymore. Can the principles of placemaking avoid that happening, do you think?
So I will answer that with potentially an example. So one of the obvious ways to ensure that a neighborhood continues to be affordable and continues to be a place where, as Francesca said, people can experiment and explore and continue being creative is through legislation. So, capped rents. Probably one of the most extreme examples that we've seen of late is Berlin. So if you look at Kreuzberg in Berlin, there's a myriad of different legislation that ensures that it continues to be this diverse entrepreneurial community where people can afford to live and work. I won't go into detail, but some of it is pretty drastic as to in terms of legislation intervening in the idea of ownership. But one of the other ways, obviously, can be long-term view, so long-term ownership that understands the value of diversity. So an example of that would be Dumbo in New York. So Dumbo was actually a big part of it. So a lot of the warehouses that you kind of see when you're in Dumbo, and that, what Dumbo means to most people. So by the way, Dumbo is across the sea in Brooklyn, across the river, sorry, in Brooklyn, Manhattan. Takes about 7 minutes to get from Manhattan to Dumbo. And Dumbo was bought by one family in 1975. A lot of those buildings, they actually sat on it for about 15 years to get planning to change it to residential and commercial and all these other things. So it's a very long-term view. The family still own it today. And what they do there is they have, you know, really beautiful high-end residential, all rentals. So they've retained the ownership of all of it, or most of it. But what they do is they supplement, so they have between 20 and 40% of their retail is capped, so they can actually have entrepreneurs do cool art galleries and do cool little shops there because they can afford to be there, and they get access to pretty affluent clientele. They do, you know, 10 to 15% of their workspace or commercial space is capped, again, to allow those small entrepreneurs to be there. They take large floor plates and cut them up. They were like the ones to do co-working before co-working was a thing, you know. And so they have all of these initiatives that they subsidize through high, you know, values per square foot or rents per square foot in other places to ensure that they still get that diversity of humans in their neighborhood, which has been very successful. They have the highest rents per square foot of residential in all of New York, including Manhattan. So, you know, it's been commercially successful as well as retaining that diversity of humans in the neighborhood.
Great stuff, thanks. Michael, what would you nominate as a successful example of placemaking?
Yeah, well, first of all, I think Eliza answered the question on the challenging governments to work with and named Berlin. So it certainly sounds pretty challenging there. I'm glad I went last to give me a good minute to think about a community that I think is doing some really interesting things. And it's less of a community, but I mean, the size of their developments are rather massive. It's a company called Daydream. They're based out of Colorado, and they are embracing and first to my knowledge to fully embrace the whole flexible living style. So live here for one night, 1 quarter, 1 year. And it's designed to drop the keys off at the front desk if you're a consultant or you're in the travel industry when you used to travel all the time, to help other people subsidize your own rent. Like it's a great theme. And they take it a few steps further. They add local shops and restaurants on the ground floor. They curate events, whether it's a mixologist or a fitness instructor or a, you know, excursion to breweries or to mountains or whatever. They're building community within their community, and it's very intentional, and it's I think it's really cool concept that will have a lot of legs and continue to do so in the future.
Great, thanks, Michael. I'll check that out. That sounds really interesting. Okay, I just want to run through a few slides before we wind up, and I thank our panelists for such a great discussion. Next week's session, as you mentioned, Michael, is about flex rentals, investing in innovation. And my colleague, Paul Stevens, who is editor of Short Term Rentals, will be hosting that one. You can see the link to register for that in the chat function, so that promises to be a good one. That one is at 4 p.m. next Wednesday. Most of these have been at 2 p.m, but next week's is at 4 p.m, so don't get caught out there. And Paul and another of my colleagues, Eloise, over at Boutique Hotel News, are about to launch a series of dedicated webinars for their respective websites. So the short-term rentals one is called Rock Stars with an STRZ, which is a nice play on our logo. And the boutique hotel-based one is called Trailblazers. And you can see the topics and the dates for those there. They should be great. So these webinars, the Urban Living webinars, are a precursor to the festival, which is taking place in November in London, as I mentioned earlier. We are really looking forward to actually hosting a face-to-face event, and seeing people in the flesh again. It's been too long. We've got a great bunch of sponsors and exhibitors on board so far. I think if we scroll through the next slide, you can see some of the names who are involved. It's a really diverse bunch of hospitality and real estate players, and some great media partners getting the word out there too. And if you'd like to get involved as a speaker, as a sponsor, as an exhibitor, then please do contact my colleague Katie, whose details are there. As I said earlier, there'll be a recording of this session going out to everybody who's registered, so you can see everything there, and Katie's LinkedIn profile is now in the chat. There are the next 3 sessions in this series, and it just leaves me to say thanks very much to Eliza, to Michael, to Peter and Francesca for another great discussion. I really enjoyed it. Thank you all, guys, and hope to see a lot of you back here for the next webinar. Thanks very much, and goodbye.
Thank you so much, guys. Bye.
Cheers.